Welcome back to the Content Area Instructional Strategies Workshop from the American Language and Culture Center at Southern Utah University. This video focuses on listening strategies. The goals for this video are to help you articulate the kinds of challenges that learners experience when they're practicing listening, and then to give you some strategies that you can work with your students to help them focus on meaning when they're listening to videos and podcasts and other types of audio input related to your content area. Let's talk about some keywords. Interference. Interference can refer to background or other kinds of noises that make it difficult for a listener to understand a speaker. Word stress refers to which syllable within a word receives the most stress. In English, words that have more than one syllable generally have at least one syllable that is very clearly and loudly and more slowly pronounced than the other syllables. And same is true when we talk about a sentence. In a sentence, some words, primarily the content words, nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, these words are pronounced more clearly and slowly than the other words in the sentence, the function words like prepositions, determiners, and pronouns. So when students can better recognize and prepare themselves for how word stress and sentence stress works in English, they'll better be able to identify what a speaker is saying and not feel so frustrated that the written way words and sentences appear in English doesn't always match what they might predict the pronunciation being. Let's return and just remind ourselves about the framework that we're using for our workshop here. We've already talked about how to highlight the language of your content area and prepare students for the particular grammar and vocabulary that may be unique to the topic that you're teaching. But we also then want to give them lots of practice focusing on meaning and understanding the meaning of your content area, both through reading and of course also through listening. So let's return to the idea of comprehensible input. We mentioned with our reading video that if we want students to focus on meaning, then they already need to know most of the language in a reading passage. If there are too many new words in the passage, they'll be so focused on the language that they won't be able to focus on the reading. And so we can help with this by either choosing passages that are likely to already be at their level, where they will already know the words, or pre-teaching the vocabulary to them before they get to the text so that they'll be prepared for it and they'll be able to focus on the meaning. So that comprehensible input is a really important part of making listening also effective for your students. The linguist researcher Stephen Krashen has proposed this model or this concept of I+1. And I+1 refers to I being what the student already knows in the language and can do, and the +1 being just a little bit more than what the student already can know and do independently. So if we are selecting a text, a listening text for our students, we want to make sure that it's only maybe just at their level or only just a little bit higher than their level, maybe just a few new words. If there's too much that's new in it, if the language is too complex, or if it's too much interference, too much background, they will become frustrated and they won't be able to focus on the meaning. So we want to make sure we're choosing good texts and that we're preparing our students to understand and listen to those texts effectively. With listening, this is a great and it's an important skill to help students practice. But if there is that interference, they're not going to be able to understand. And so some of the things we can do is looking for texts that have been designed for an English language learning audience. And thankfully, with the internet, there's lots of great websites that provide listening samples and even quizzes and other activities that we can use to help our students practice listening and focusing on the meaning. Well, we could also find a text that we're interested in, maybe a podcast or video or other recording, and we could maybe re-record it or adapt it for our audience so that it's clearer, it's simpler, And it helps students practice listening, but not at a level that's too hard or difficult for them. So let's talk about some specific strategies that you could implement in your classroom. Now, the first one is to pre-teach vocabulary. We've been talking about this, right? But if you know that your students are going to be dealing with a listening material, and there is a particular word in it that's very important, but maybe new for your students, pre-teach that vocabulary word so that then when they hear it, they'll recognize it. They'll know how to spell it, they'll know what the meaning is, and they'll recognize the pronunciation. When you pre-teach vocabulary, that pronunciation part is really important for students because sometimes the way they think a word will be pronounced doesn't match the way English speakers pronounce it. Another thing we can do is offer lots of contextual clues when students are listening. If we can have images, photos, or if we can add video to the listening, then that gives them some context to kind of imagine and understand what's happening during the listening. Or if you provide some background information, you let students know they're going to be listening to something. Here's the overall structure. Here's the things you want them to listen for or focus on. That can help prepare their mind so that they have a goal and a target when they head into the listening. Another great thing to do is to model your own listening process. I like to do this. I call it a think aloud. And what I do is I'll play a listening for students and I will occasionally pause it. And I'll tell students what I'm thinking as I'm listening. And if there's a word, I can say, hey, I think I recognize that word. I think the word means this. Or I'll say other things like, oh, now the speaker said this. I predict that they might say this next. I think this is what this video or this podcast is about. If you can model good listening processes for your students, that will give them more confidence to employ good listening strategies when they listen as well. Another thing you can do is repeat the same listening more than once. Often it will take learners a few times, but the first time they might be listening more for language. Can they handle the speaking rate of the speakers? Can they understand any new vocabulary? And it might take that first time just for them to process the language. Then the second time, they might be able to focus on the meaning. Most learners cannot focus on language and meaning at the same time. It's different processes in the brain. It requires lots of mental energy. So first, if you need to, focus on the language, then go back and focus on the meaning. What is the purpose of what the author or the speaker is saying? What are they trying to teach us? Remixing is another great strategy. If you can have more than one article or video or podcast on a topic, that can give students a chance to hear different people or different voices or different mediums that are presenting the same content. And so this can be very helpful if one particular video is difficult for them to understand. Maybe that speaker of English uses a particular accent that they're not familiar with. But if they could watch another video, maybe someone speaks with a slower voice, or it uses different visuals, or maybe it's an article that they could look at. That remixing or presenting information in multiple formats can allow students to bring information from multiple sources to really understand the content. One last strategy I would suggest is teaching students about discourse markers. So discourse markers are signal words or phrases that help listeners or readers understand how a text is organized. So for example, if you go to an academic lecture and someone says, I would like to talk about 3 things today, that can be a discourse marker. They're introducing the structure of their lecture. And as a listener, I would know that I need to pay attention to 3 things. I might even, in my notebook, start writing 1, 2, and 3. And when I hear the speaker identify what those 3 things are, I'll be able to put them in my notes. Taking notes can be a great way to help students with their listening skills and then compare with each other or compare with the teacher if they've understood the text correctly. But other discourse markers are helpful in other ways. They can help us understand maybe how things are sequenced. They can help us understand whether the speaker is comparing and contrasting things. So helping your students identify particular discourse markers that are common in your field or that fit the kinds of listening texts that people conduct in your field can help students recognize those words and then understand how they may want to take notes on the page, or at least think in their mind about how they're going to organize the information that they're learning. So discourse markers are great for note-taking, but they also help students better build a mental picture of what they're listening to. So I hope that these strategies have given you some new ideas about how you can help your students focus on meaning when they're doing listening in your content area.